In this video, I'd like to say a little bit about the history of the Mass before we start looking at the actual parts of the Mass itself. And I think it would be helpful to begin just by defining what we mean when we say the word the Mass. So let's just start there for a moment. The first thing you want to highlight is there are actually lots of different names for what we commonly as Roman Catholics call the Mass. So for example, you'll often see the celebration of the Eucharist described as the Eucharist. The Greek word Eucharist means thanksgiving, right? Eucharistia. So that's one ancient name for the Mass. Another name would be the breaking of the bread. This is actually one of the earliest descriptions of the Eucharistic celebration. We see it in the book of Acts, chapter 2, for example, where it will say that the early apostles would gather together for the breaking of the bread. That's kind of a shorthand way of referring to the early Eucharistic celebration. Another name for what we call the Mass would be the Holy Sacrifice. This would emphasize that whenever we gather together and the priest consecrates the bread and the wine, that he's not only celebrating a meal in a memorial of the Last Supper of Christ, but that he's offering a sacrifice through which we participate in the one sacrifice of Christ at Calvary. Other names for the Eucharist would be the Lord's Supper, which is what St. Paul refers to the Eucharist as in 1 Corinthians 10 or 11, or to Holy Communion. You'll sometimes see it called that. Also, terminology from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, when he talks about our communion in the blood of Christ and the body of Christ with the cup of blessing and the bread that we drink and that we eat. So these are all various names for what we call the Mass, and they're like, in a sense, facets of a diamond. The Eucharist is such a profound mystery that you can turn it just like a diamond and look at it from each angle and see a different facet of the mystery. And those different names actually bring out the various aspects of the mystery of the Eucharist. But the name Mass is a very particular name that comes not from the ancient Greek names for the Eucharist, but from the Latin. So if you look in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the last name it gives for the Eucharist is the Holy Mass, and this is how it explains and defined it. The Catechism says that we refer to the Eucharist as, quote, Holy Mass, Missa in Latin, because the liturgy in which the mystery of salvation is accomplished concludes with the sending forth, the missio of the faithful, so that they may fulfill God's will in their daily lives, end quote. So if you actually go and you look at the very ending of the Mass, even to this day, if you go to the end of the liturgy of the Mass, one of the last things that will be said by the deacon or the priest are the words, "Go forth, the Mass is ended." And in Latin, that is ite missa es. Go forth. It is the sending, or to translate it literally, it's the sending forth. It's the missio. It's the dismissal of the faithful. And then, of course, the people say in response, thanks be to God. As a young Catholic growing up when I was a little kid, this was my favorite part of the Mass. When I heard, go forth, the Mass was ended, I said, thanks be to God, because the liturgy was over. I could go home and go play or whatever it might be. All right. So that expression, when we refer to the Mass as the Mass, that's a distinctively Latin name for the Eucharistic liturgy. And it comes from the end of the Mass, from the dismissal. Now, this is a very ancient way of referring to the Mass. It actually goes at least as far back as the 7th century AD. One of the most ancient descriptions of the Mass we possess, of a papal Mass, I should say. We've got earlier ones of just the Mass in general, but a papal Mass is from an order of the Roman Mass called Order Romanus I. And it's a description of the papal Mass, and it actually describes the ending of the Mass, the dismissal, as follows. It says this, quote, after the Eucharistic celebration is finished, whichever deacon the archdeacon has appointed will glance toward the Pope, so the Pope's present, so that he may signal to him, and he chants to the people, Ite missa est, go forth, the Mass is finished. And the people respond, Deo gratias, or thanks be to God. Right? So you can actually see in the ancient Roman liturgy there of the Pope himself where the terminology of the Mass comes from. It comes from the dismissal of the people at the end of the liturgy. And in fact, if I had more time, we could go into this and look at it in more depth and see that over time in the ancient church, there would actually be two dismissals that formed the basis for the name of the Mass. So the first half of the Mass would end with the dismissal of catechumens. So it was called the Mass of the catechumens. This involved the introductory rites and the liturgy of the Word. And then those who had not yet been baptized would be dismissed. They would be sent out before the liturgy of the Eucharist and the sacrifice of the Mass proper began. That second half of the Mass, which we call the liturgy of the Eucharist, was known as the Mass of the Faithful. So baptized people would be able to stay in the sanctuary, stay in the church, and participate in the liturgy of the Eucharist until they receive their dismissal at the very end of the Mass, which is what we just read. So it's interesting to me that in the Roman liturgy, we put so much emphasis, even in the very name, on the dismissal, either the dismissal of the catechumens or the dismissal of the faithful. So that these two parts of the Mass of the catechumens and Mass of the faithful, form one missa, one liturgy, one holy Mass. All right, so from this point on, when I'm talking about the Mass, I will be discussing the Eucharistic celebration, the liturgy, all of the rites and signs and ceremonies that make up the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. With one qualification, I want to stress that by using the term the Mass, I'm going to be referring to the Roman rite of Mass in particular. Okay, this is very important. Some Catholics aren't aware of this, many are, but it's important to note, in case you may not know, that in the Catholic Church, right, so in the church is in communion with the successor of St. Peter, the Pope, right, throughout all the Catholic Church, not every Catholic belongs to the Roman rite. Not every Catholic celebrates the Roman liturgy. There are, in fact, other liturgical rites that are often tied to the various languages in which the liturgy is celebrated. The Catechism of the Catholic Church does a great job of describing these rites in a brief way. So if you have a catechism, it might be worth looking at this because it's a helpful and interesting description of the different liturgical traditions that make up the one Holy Catholic Church. So in paragraph 1202 and 1203, it says this: the diverse liturgical traditions have arisen by very reason of the Church's mission. Churches of the same geographical and cultural area came to celebrate the mystery of Christ through particular expressions characterized by the culture. Right? So pause there. In particular, it was the language of the culture as well as the geography of the various liturgical traditions that gave rise to different rites of liturgy. For example, in paragraph 1203, the Catechism says, the liturgical traditions or rites presently in use in the Church are the Latin rites, principally the Roman rite, but also the rites of certain local churches, such as the Ambrosian rite or those of certain religious orders, like the Dominicans, and then the Byzantine, Alexandrian or Coptic rites, Syriac, Armenian, Maronite, and Chaldean rites. Now, if you pause there, you'll notice that these are divided, these different liturgical traditions are divided according to both language and geography, right? So the Latin rites are principally the Western rites. They're all celebrated in the Latin language. They consist of the Roman Rite, the Ambrosian Rite, which goes all the way back to St. Ambrose, who was bishop of the Church of Milan, and then the rites of certain religious orders like the Dominican Rite, for example. All these are in the Latin language. But the Eastern rites are in different languages. So for example, the Byzantine Rite is in Greek. Their liturgy is in Greek. The Alexandrian Rite, which would go back to the Church of Alexandria, which according to tradition was founded by St. Mark, that rite is in Coptic, which is a form of ancient Egyptian. And then you have other rites like the Syriac Rite, which are performed in the language of Jesus himself. Syriac is basically an ancient form of Christian Aramaic, right? So what you see here is as the apostles went out into the world and brought the gospel to various locations, right? Various cities like Alexandria in Egypt or Rome in Italy, they also adapted the liturgy of the Eucharist into the languages of those peoples, whether they be Greek or Coptic or Syriac or eventually Latin, right? So the church recognizes, and this is important, it actually says, in faithful obedience to tradition, the Sacred Council declares that Holy Mother Church holds all lawfully recognized rights to be of equal right, R-I-G-H-T there, and dignity, and she wishes to preserve them in the future and foster them in every way. So in other words, there are lots of different liturgical traditions, lots of different liturgical rites in the Catholic Church. By far, the biggest of these is the Roman Rite. So the vast majority of Catholics who are in communion with the Pope belong to the Roman Rite. Sometimes people will call it the Latin Rite, but Latin Rite is actually a somewhat broader category. It can include some of these other forms like the Ambrosian and Dominican. But the Roman Rite in particular means the liturgical tradition that's particular to the Church of Rome and particular to, especially associated with the liturgy as celebrated by the Holy Fathers, the popes, the successors of St. Peter in Rome. So in our study, what we're going to be focusing on when we look at the Mass, I'm specifically focusing on the Roman Rite, the tradition of the Eucharistic celebration as practiced in Rome from the time of St. Peter all the way up to our own day today, right? So if you want to follow along with me, you will want to, for example, get a copy either of the daily Roman Missal. This is one that I bring to Mass myself, which is the current form of the Roman Rite that's celebrated in the church today. Or you might study along with one of the missals that is actually used by a priest in celebrating the Mass. So you can see this is a chapel edition of the Roman Missal. It's very beautifully illustrated, published by Catholic Book Publishing. And I want you to see something about the description here. Notice what it says. The Roman Missal, renewed by decree of the Most Holy Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, promulgated by the authority of Pope Paul VI, and revised at the direction of Pope John Paul II. So this missal was originally promulgated officially in the year 1970, and then it was updated and then republished in a final edition or third edition in the year 2000 at the millennium by Pope John Paul II. So if you want to follow along, you want to ask what version of the Roman Missal will I be studying in the course of our series, just be aware that our principal focus is going to be what is known as the Missal of Paul VI and John Paul II. Sometimes it's called the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of Mass, because of the changes that were made to the Missal by the Second Vatican Council and by Pope Paul VI in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Right? So we'll be using this as our principal text. However, as we're moving through the course of our study, we're also going to be comparing and contrasting the contents of the contemporary Roman Missal with other forms of the Roman Missal or of the Roman liturgy throughout the centuries. So just as an example, we'll be looking at we'll be comparing and contrasting the Roman Missal of 1962. This missal was promulgated by Pope St. John the 23rd, so sometimes called the Missal of John the 23rd. And it's, in contemporary parlance, it's often referred to as the traditional Latin Mass, or the preconciliar Mass, or the Tridentine Mass. All those different names are used for the Missal of St. John the 23rd, which was issued in 1962. But this is not the only missal that's part of the Roman Rite that we'll be looking at. There are older missals than even that. For example, we'll make some comparisons with the Missal of the Council of Trent that was published in 1570. We'll be looking at missals that go all the way back to the 13th century, like the Ordinal of the Papal Court from the time of Innocent III. This is the 13th century. Or other missals or orders of Mass like the Order of the Roman Church that I mentioned earlier from the 7th century AD, or also the sacramentary, or the description of the Mass associated with Pope St. Gregory the Great in the 6th and 7th century, or the sacramentary associated with Pope St. Gelasius, known as the Galatian sacramentary. St. Gelasius was Pope in the 5th century. So as you'll see, there's lots of changes in the Mass, changes in the missals and sacramentary, the various books celebrated and associated with the Mass. But as we're going to see, and I hope you'll see over the course of our study, there's also continuity with the Roman Church and the Roman tradition. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you, so we're not going to look at all that at the same time. What I'd prefer to do is just take one example, and we'll end with this. I want to take a peek at the earliest description of the Roman liturgy